today's sectarian climate because it echoes back to a past, although fictional, that suggests that Iraqis of different religious and ethnic backgrounds can actually coexist. And then came the lecture, which she's very fond of doing, and she told me that expecting her to tell the truth on the record, pointing out that this is real, you know, people can be killed for these things. And this later exchange also initiated over a session of coffee drinking. Frequently, these informal exchanges blurred the boundaries of personal and private in a way that made me, as interviewer, implicit in the intimate exchange. This was especially so in interviews with members of religious minorities like Chaldeans, who are Catholic Iraqis, and Armenians. I was interested in the ways that women from these religious groups had internalized what is largely a Muslim collective national narrative. Their narrative certainly suggested that the current civil unrest and sectarian conflict shapes the lens through which they now position their identity in relation to the homeland. But what really struck me was the frequency with which discussions about religion initiated the retelling of an imposed national narrative. And this was true of women from all religious backgrounds. So the discussion of religion has become part of a violent and painful present that most women sought to avoid discussing during the taped interview. In some cases, the act of consuming coffee was used to interlace past with present, weaving intimate exchanges with recollections of the past. This was a case during an interview in Amman with a renowned fortune teller. We spent a very lazy afternoon sitting on her porch with the smell of jasmine thick in the air and branches of ripe figs overhead. It was a beautiful day. In the midst of the interview, the fortune teller, and she was an Armenian refugee from Iraq, she abruptly picked up my coffee cup and began to tell me my fortune. As she was delivering promises of future wealth and happiness, she was also carefully weaving into the reading threads of her personal experiences and memories of Iraq. Her revelations about the persecution of the Armenian minority became a narrative in defense of her people's suffering. So she wove her understanding of Iraq's religious sectarianism into this extra-religious ritual that is by all accounts considered haram, or against God's law. In this case, coffee featured prominently as the centerpiece around which narrative was woven, and the intersections of past and present, as well as truth and fiction, however we may want to define those. As she held my cup and gazed into my future, she told her story through the coffee grinds, weaving her past and present with my future. This part of our exchange initiated an almost ethereal intimacy in which I was drawn into and made a part of the painful reality of her narrative. Of course, not all of the exchanges were this intimate or this powerful. In many cases, coffee initiated a period of informal discussion that more often than not led to gossip, often of a very unkind nature. A woman's reputation and the impending threat of bad rumors and malicious gossip play a very real role in the lives of Iraqi women in diaspora. In the dissertation, I argued that a new trend in second-generation women who are beginning to wear the hijab or the head covering is directly related to their fear that their modesty will be called into question should there be gossip against them. So during a group interview in Detroit, we ended with coffee and sweets, and the women soon moved the conversation onto a topic of a girl from the community that had become pregnant out of wedlock, which is relatively uncommon, so this was big news. As the women picked apart the girl's reputation, they blamed the mother and the fact that the mother clearly had no morals, indicating that it was the mother that was to blame for the woman's transgression. while the blame lay with the mother, the shame was all associated with the father. And of course, the poor sons of the family who would never marry well because of this black mark against the family's honour. So I offer this as an example and a reminder that not all intimate exchanges over coffee were particularly pleasant or even invited. And that in some cases, coffee actually initiated a period of very uncomfortable personal questions, many of which were directed at me. Offers of marriage, which I rejected. And also, in some cases, incriminating accounts of women's roles in the Ba'ath regime, which I was always very unsure how to use in my cases. So the central or ceremonial role of food and drink in negotiating memory is definitely an important part of understanding how Iraqi women in diaspora shape their narrative. Iraqi women clearly articulated two very different and often conflicting narratives. So it's important then to listen in stereo to understand how these narratives work together. And it was coffee that really opened up the informal discussion, almost as a site of resistance where women could discuss personal experiences of trauma, war, and displacement. This ritual of coffee in a largely female space opened up these new conversations about identity and belonging. And I would argue then that it is in these private spaces initiated by coffee that Iraqi women were inserting themselves back into their own history. Thank you very much.
So thank you for three really great papers that sort of take us into this realm of the cultural meanings attached to food production, consumption, food traditions, food exchanges. And I'm wondering if you have any questions for our presenters. Yes?
Your question, observation, directed to the jam making. It's of course become popular once again. There's a huge resurgence in making one's own jam and marmalade and pickles. So I don't think we're going to endanger losing that particular part of our food heritage.
This one's for Emily. You mentioned that your grandfather talked about watching food being prepared. Did he ever talk about helping in the kitchen when he was a child? Or
He didn't talk about helping. He talked about stealing food.
You want to come to the microphone?
The microphone comes off the
Oh, it comes off. Oh, the microphone will have to you.
No, he didn't talk about participating at all. But nowadays he has a bread oven outside. He makes his own bread. And my grandma was diagnosed with cancer last year, and he makes all of their food now. She isn't able to make very much. So I don't know exactly when he learned how to make it, but I think it's a lot from just being a kid. They did a lot in the bush and things like that. His dad would bring a pork chop and a farm pan and a backpack, and they'd go out. So, they would have that sort of thing. And they have a maple sugar bush, and they would have been making a little bit of food there too. So, but in the home, he didn't mention anything about it. Thank you.
Sounds like when there's grilling and fire and bush involved, then the men cook, right? Jane?
I have two questions. Well, one comment and one question. And first is, you're right, lots of people now make jam, but it's a different sense, I think. My sense is it's now a sort of crafty, I too can do it. It's not because I have to. It's not because I must or should preserve whatever. And so I think that's sort of one of the interesting things I find intriguing is how foodways and food preparation change relative to class, community, availability and stuff. Because we also live in a world where we can get kiwis now and have laws in ways that would be unimaginable. Like we never used. I'm old enough to remember when there were seasons for things. You only had. Soon, in Ontario, we're going to get fiddleheads. Fiddleheads we're going to get, which will be lovely, and I will be able to get in my local store. I live stores in the country local asparagus, so like you get it from my neighbors. But after that, it moved on me, still, because of my age, to really buy asparagus in December. Because it's not from a hell of a long way away, and it's like wood. And so it's just interesting how they change.
But I would add the very fact people choose to make it nowadays is critical to it being continued.
Oh, I agree.
There's no force involved. So that, I think, is why it's so interesting. People like it, they value it, and they admire it. And they recognize it tastes better. The work, the effort.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Just to add to that.
The things that, like my sister making the chow chow, the green ketchups and things like that, those are not, maybe in Southern Ontario that's making a comeback too, but I know that where we are, in my community, it's not something that people eat frequently. But my grandparents talked about eating those things every day with their meal. You'd have your meat and potatoes and a scoop of chow chow or a scoop of green ketchup. And that sort of practice has fallen out of play. You know, you wouldn't just dump a whole bunch of ketchup on your plate and scoop it up with your spoon. So I think that sort of thing is changing, and maybe, hopefully, it comes back, and hopefully we see the value of it.
Question, Jane.
So I have a question, and that's to all three of you. All three of you did interviews, right? Can you talk a little bit about interviews, and how people responded when you wanted to talk about food or drink, or how it inadvertently worked?
Alison, do you want to start? I only interviewed Ione Anderson by email, so it's awkward. I've met her in the past at a genealogy meeting, and she is probably 80. I'm so amazed she's on email, and she probably was thinking, why does this girl want to know about farming? But she gave me a few really nice points, I think. But probably I need to go ask her to explain further, maybe, and see what she really meant rather than thinking about it. But there's definitely at Six Nations a big revival. It's similar to what we're talking about in terms of planting these foods and making traditional foods, and farmers markets every weekend, and pickles being sold, and all sorts of that's definitely happening. So I don't think she'd be surprised if I was interested in it, but that's a whole other project that could be done, I think, on this.
The interviewing was okay in my family. Some people had lots to say. Some people, I didn't understand really why they wouldn't have lots to say, but I think a lot of people, even there, it's just food, what? So a couple of people disappointed me, I found, because they didn't have very much to say. My one sister giggled through the entire 20 minutes. It was painful. But then I think my father could have talked for a great amount of time. In my OPA, I was luckily running out of tape, and my OMA came in and said, I think this is enough, She didn't quite say it that way, but that was sort of the way it happened. So I got different responses, some very positive and some surprisingly not so great.
I did a lot of interviews, so I won't talk about them too much. I did find, one thing I will say, I did find that the location did really shape the kind of interview that I had. And what came out of the interviews that I did in the Middle East and Oman were distinctly different from the ones that I did in North America. I didn't specifically ask about food or drink, except in Detroit, where there is this big Chaldean community, so they're Catholic Iraqis. It's the biggest community of Chaldeans outside of Iraq. The next biggest being in Chicago, I believe, or in San Diego. But one of the women from the community had become quite famous locally for publishing this Chaldean cookbook, which she had gone on then to publicize on TV and in the newspapers. And it was written as a Chaldean cookbook. She'd gone around the community, so she had provided 2 or 3 recipes for each thing that you could make, so you could see the different ingredients. But I was interested in going back actually to interview her, because she had plans for a new cookbook that she was going to she was going to title as an Iraqi cookbook. And I thought that's really interesting, because then she's shaping a different kind of Iraqi identity in the public. So, yeah.
this is just to tie together some of these issues, the thing about interviews and food and jam. And I did my first oral interview history project back in 1980. And I was going to Quebec to interview former textile workers. The oldest lady I interviewed had been started as a spinner in 1908. And I interviewed 82 women in 2 different communities about the work they had done in the mills. Well, 1980 was the first referendum in Quebec. So you had this great surge of the independence movement. And here I was coming as an Anglophone who spoke French, but obviously with a French accent from France, not from Quebec. And I was, although I grew up on a farm, I was still an academic, so that sort of made me more like middle class. So I was going into these working class quarters, people I'd never met before, and trying to get their trust and confidence. So I found the very best way was to interview them in the kitchen and then talk to them about, oh, you're making strawberry jam. How do you make your strawberry jam?